Eulalie's stepmother laughed when she inherited only the puppy. The sound was sharp, cruel, echoing to the cold library like breaking glass. Eulalie clutched the small terrier tighter, feeling her world collapse into this single, humiliating moment. Then the door opened. Phineas Wentworth, the Duke of Ashton, stepped into the room. His rugged gray eyes swept past the smirking Baroness, past the sneering relatives, and landed on the trembling dog in Eulalie's arms. "That animal," he said, his voice cutting through Baroness Clotilde's laughter like a blade through silk, "is the last living descendant of the Ashton hunting line. By the Charter of 1672, the dog and its current guardian fall under protection of my estate." His gaze finally met Eulalie's. "Miss Moss belongs to me now." The room fell into stunned silence. But what does this ancient claim truly mean? Is Eulalie being rescued or simply transferred from one cage to another? And why does the formidable Duke of Ashton care so desperately about one scruffy little dog? What hidden sorrow drives the Duke to stake his claim, and how will it shatter Eulalie's fragile world before mending it anew? Welcome, my dear listeners. Before we dive deeper into how Baroness Clotilde's venomous mockery sets the stage for an unexpected twist of fate, tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. Whether at a cozy corner by the fire or amid the bustle of the city, hit that like button if her cruelty already has you rooting against her, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us defy villains like her by sharing more stories of triumph and love with you all. Let me know in the comments, Team Duke or Team Puppy. The fire in the library had been allowed to die. Eulalie Moss sat rigidly on a straight-back chair that had been positioned deliberately. She suspected, at the furthest edge of the room from the meager warmth of the hearth. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced to stop their trembling, the red trim cuffs of her outdated dress fraying slightly under her anxious grip. Beneath her chair, hidden in the shadows of her skirts, her father's small terrier, Pip, pressed against her ankles. The dog's warmth was the only comfort she had left. Across the room, Baroness Clotilde reclined on the velvet settee, like a portrait of satisfied conquest. Her voluminous blonde hair was coal of perfection, and her tight pearl necklace seemed to choke the very air around her. She wore a dress of mourning that was far too fashionable for genuine grief, commissioned from London the moment Eulalie's father had taken to his deathbed. Her jewelry caught what little gray light filtered through the windows, the pearls at her throat gleaming like cold, unfeeling eyes. Mr. Thaddeus, the family solicitor, cleared his throat, the dry sound rattling in the silence of the library like dead leaves skittering across stone. The fire had long since turned to ash, and the chill in the room seemed to settle deep within Eulalie Moss's bones. She sat rigidly, her hands clutching the worn fabric of her dress, an outdated gown with a square neckline and red trim cuffs that had seen better seasons. She knew she looked a fright. Her strawberry blonde locks were pulled back severely, though a few rebellious strands escaped a frame of face dusted with faint freckles that stood out starkly against her pale, anxious skin. "To my beloved wife, Baroness Clotilde," Mr. Thaddeus read, his voice devoid of emotion, "I leave the entirety of the Moss estate, the townhouse in London, and all remaining financial assets." Across the room, Baroness Clotilde shifted on the velvet settee. Her voluminous blonde hair, piled high in an elaborate coiffure that mocked the solemnity of the occasion, did not move, but her lips curled into a victorious sneer. She sat with an aggressive posture, her chest heaving slightly, so that the tight pearl necklace around her throat seemed in danger of snapping. She looked less like a grieving widow, and more like a dragon surveying its hoard. "And to my daughter Eulalie," the solicitor continued, pausing as if embarrassed by the words on the page, "I leave Pip." Eulalie blinked, her breath catching. "Pip." "The dog," Clotilde said, her voice sharp and cruel. She threw her head back and laughed, the sound echoing off the high, dusty shelves. "He left you the mongrel." a fitting inheritance for a stray. Eulalie looked down at her feet, where the tiny gray bundle of fur lay shivering. Pip, a scruffy terrier with eyes too big for his head, whined softly and pressed his wet nose against her ankle. It was the only warmth left in her world. "You have an hour to pack your things," Clotilde announced, standing abruptly. Her silk skirts rustled with the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. "I will not have you or that flea-bitten creature soiling my carpets a moment longer. This state is mine. You are evicted." Eulalie felt the tears prick her eyes, hot and humiliating. She bent to scoop Pip into her arms, burying her face in his coarse fur to hide her trembling chin. She was nobody, a girl with an old dress and a puppy, cast out into the unforgiving world. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the library groaned open. A draft of winter air swirled into the room, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. Phineas Wentworth, the Duke of Ashton, stepped across the threshold. He was a towering figure, his presence instantly sucking the oxygen from the room. His dark hair was wind-blown, wild against his brow, and a jagged scar etched across his chin gave his rugged face a dangerous, brooding quality. Clotilde's mouth opened to issue a reprimand for the intrusion, but the words died in her throat as the Duke's storm-gray eyes swept over her as if she were furniture. He did not look at the solicitor. He did not look at the grand paintings. He walked straight to Eulalie. "Let me see him," he commanded, his voice low and rough, like gravel grinding together. Eulalie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held Pip out tentatively. The Duke reached out, his large, gloved hand surprisingly gentle as he tilted the puppy's head. He examined the markings on the dog's ears, his expression unreadable. "It is him," Phineas murmured, moored himself into the room. He straightened, turning his cold gaze upon the baffled Baroness. "This animal is the last living descendant of the Ashton hunting line. By the Charter of 1672, the dog and its current guardian fall under the sole protection of my estate. That is preposterous," Clotilde shrieked, her pearls trembling. "You cannot simply—" "I can, and I have—" Phineas cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned back to Eulalie, offering her his arm. "Come, Miss Moss. You do not belong here." Before she could process the shift in her reality, Eulalie found herself swept out of the house and into a waiting carriage blacker than midnight. As the vehicle lurched forward, leaving the only home she had ever known behind, she glanced across the carriage at her savior. Phineas sat in the shadows, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the window ledge with white-knuckled intensity. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Pip, who slept soundly in her lap, with a haunting mixture of grief and desperation. As the wheels rattled over the cobblestones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled over Eulalie. This was no fairy tale rescue. There was a darkness in the Duke's silence, a secret locked behind that scar on his chin. He clung to the scruffy pup as if it were a lifeline, and Eulalie couldn't help but wonder if she had been saved from the wolf only to be trapped in the dragon's lair, bound by a web of unspoken pain she was never meant to understand. The carriage wheels finally ceased their rhythmic grinding against the gravel, signaling the end of a journey that felt less like travel and more like a crossing into another world. Ashton Hall rose in the clinging mist of the countryside, a sprawling monolith of gray stone and dark windows that seemed to swallow the fading light. Eulalie stepped down, clutching Pip against her chest, her boots sinking slightly into the pristine manicured drive. The air here was cleaner, sharper, but it carried a weight, a silence so profound it felt almost judgmental. Inside, the contrast of the cold exterior was jarring. The entrance hall was a cavern of warmth and opulence, lit by a chandelier that dripped crystal tears. Thick carpets muffled their footsteps, and the scent of beeswax and old wood hung heavy in the air. A fleet of servants appeared and disappeared like ghosts, whisking away her meager trunk, but Phineas dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand. He led her into a private drawing room, the door clicking shut behind them with finality that made Eulalie's breath hitch. She stood near the hearth, the heat of the roaring fire flushing her cheeks, making the faint freckles across her nose stand out against her pallor. She still wore the same outdated dress with the red trim cuffs, a garment that looked pitifully threadbare against the damask silk of the Duke's furniture. Phineas did not ask her to sit. He moved to the window, turning his back to her, his silhouette framed by the darkening ground beyond. "You will want for nothing here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the passion he had shown in the library. "Your rooms are prepared in the east wing. You will have an allowance for a new wardrobe. Burn that thing you are wearing, and you will dine with me when my schedule permits." Eulalie stroked Pip's head, her fingers trembling. "Your Grace, I do not know how to thank you. You saved us." Phineas turned slowly. The firelight caught the jagged scar on his chin, deepening the shadows of his rugged face. He did not look at her. His gaze dropped instantly to the puppy in her arms, his eyes tracing the animal's breathing with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. "Do not mistake this for sentimentality, Miss Moss," he said, his tone hardening like cooling iron. "This is a transaction. By the terms of the charter, the guardian of the Ashton heir," he nodded at the dog, "must be housed and maintained. My duty is to the bloodline this animal carries. You are merely the vessel required to keep him calm." The word struck Eulalie like a physical blow. She felt the blood rush to her face, her freckles burning with humiliation. For a moment, the luxurious room dissolved, replaced by the memory of Clotilde's sneer. "You are evicted." Was this truly different? She had been discarded by one owner and collected by another, not for who she was, but for what she carried. As if sensing the sudden spike in tension, Pip wiggled free from Eulalie's grasp. The puppy landed on the expensive Persian rug with soft thump and immediately began to wage war against a tassel on the heavy velvet drapes. He growled, a tiny, ferocious sound, and tripped over his own paws, tumbling into a somersault that ended with him shaking his head in confusion. A muscle in Phineas's jaw jumped. For a fleeting second, the harsh lines around his eyes softened. He took a step forward, his hand twitching at his side as if he longed to reach out, to scoop the creature up. But then he stopped, his posture rigid, sealing himself back behind his fortress of indifference. He looked away from the dog and finally met Eulalie's eyes, though his gaze was guarded a wall of gray ice. "The staff will see to your needs," he muttered, turning back to the door. "Keep the dog safe, Miss Moss. That is your only purpose here." When he left, the silence rushed back in, suffocating and vast. Eulalie sank onto the nearest chair, her heart heavy in her chest. Pip abandoned the curtain tassel and trotted over, resting his chin on her shoe. She looked down at him, doubt clouding her mind. She was surrounded by silk and warmth, safe from the cold winds of poverty, yet she felt a familiar chill. This was a sanctuary built on rules and cold duty, presided over by a man who looked at a puppy with the eyes of someone haunting a graveyard. Was she truly free, or had she merely traded Clotilde's cruel laughter for the Duke's gilded cage? The storm arrived 3 nights later, a tempest that rattled the window panes of Ashton Hall and turned the world beyond the glass into a churning abyss of charcoal and rain. Inside the library, the atmosphere was brittle. Phineas stood by the hearth, not looking at the fire, but staring into the dark corners of the room, his body rigid as a bowstring drawn too tight. Every crack of thunder seemed to strike him physically, making the jagged scar on his chin twitch in a rhythmic, painful spasm. Pip, sensing the tension, whined and buried his head under Eulalie's arm. She sat near the fire, her needlepoint forgotten in her lap. "He frightens you," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the wind. "Not the storm. The dog." Phineas turned sharply, his gray eyes wild. "He does not frighten me, Miss Moss." He haunts me. He paced toward her, stopping just short of the chair. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the rugged terrain of his grief. You asked why I care for him. It is because I am the reason his ancestor died. He took a ragged breath, his gaze fixing on the sleeping puppy. Dash. That was his name. I was 12, arrogant and foolish. I thought I could outrun a storm, just like this one on the moors. I called him to follow me across the river. His voice cracked, losing its aristocratic polish. The water rose too fast. I made it to the bank. Dash did not. Eulalie's heart ached, a sudden, sharp pang of empathy that pierced through her own insecurities. She watched his hand tremble as he reached out, hovering inches from Pip's fur before pulling back, his fist clenching at his side. I vowed then, he whispered, the word sounding like a curse, that I would never again be the cause of such innocence being extinguished. I cannot love him, Eulalie. I can only ensure he survives me. As Pip shifted, curling tighter against Eulalie's warmth, she realized the depth of the fortress Phineas had built around his heart. It wasn't coldness. It was a desperate defense against a wound that had never healed. She wanted to reach out, to touch that scarred hand, but fear held her back. Could she truly heal a man so broken without shattering her own fragile spirit in the process? If the fear of missing out on stories like this, where hidden traumas unravel into hope, grips you, subscribe now without a second thought. And if you won't, head to the comments and lament why you let such emotional journeys slip away. For outside these walls, a betrayal from Clotilde's past was already festering, waiting to ignite a storm far fiercer than the wind howling against the stone. In the days that followed the storm, the heavy gloom of Ashton Hall began to lift, chased away not by the sun, but by the chaotic joy of a gray puppy who refused to understand the concept of dignity. Pip was a force of nature, chewing on antique table legs and stealing the Duke's riding gloves with a mischievous growl that echoed to the grand corridors. One crisp morning in the gardens, Phineas found them near the rose bushes. Pip had managed to entangle himself in a fallen vine, looking up with wide, pleading eyes. Without thinking, Phineas knelt in the dirt, his expensive breeches staining as he gently worked the thorns away from the soft fur. "You are a menace," Phineas murmured, but there was no bite in his tone. "He takes after his guardian, I suspect," Eulalie teased, surprised by her own boldness. Phineas looked up, and for the first time the gray ice in his eyes melted into something resembling warmth. A small, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The side without the scar. "Perhaps he does." Eulalie laughed, a bright, melodic sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. The morning sun caught her strawberry blonde locks, turning them into a halo of fire and gold against the green of the garden. For a moment, Phineas stared at her, entranced, as if seeing her for the very first time not as a ward or a burden, but as a woman who brought light into his gray world. The moment hung between them, fragile and electric, charged with a tentative affection that terrified and thrilled her. But the spell was broken by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. The butler approached, his expression grave, holding a silver tray. "A letter, Your Grace," he intoned. "From London." Phineas took the envelope, and Eulalie felt the temperature drop. The seal was red wax, stamped with a crest she knew too well. It was a letter from Baroness Clotilde. As Phineas broke the seal, his face hardened once more, the sunlight fading from his eyes. The venom of the city had finally found its way to their sanctuary, and Eulalie knew with a sinking heart that their fragile peace was about to be besieged. London did not whisper. It hissed. The season was at its height, a dazzling, dizzying carousel of balls, soirees, and high-stakes social maneuvering. To Eulalie, who had spent her life in the quiet shadows of a library, the crushing weight of 1,000 judging eyes felt heavier than any storm on the moors. She stood at the edge of the Marquis of Queensberry's grand salon, her fingers twisting the fabric of her gown. Despite the Duke's generous allowance, Eulalie had chosen a dress of pale sage silk with a modest square neckline, a style that felt safe, yet now, surrounded by the plunging bodices and glittering diamonds of the ton, left her feeling woefully plain. She felt like a field mouse who had wandered into a nest of vipers, her strawberry blonde hair simple and unadorned amidst a sea of powdered wigs and jeweled tiaras. "Chin up, Eulalie," Phineas murmured, stepping to her side. He looked devastating in his formal evening wear, the black velvet emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, though he tugged at the cravat as if it were a noose. "They smell fear. Do not give them the satisfaction." At his heel, tethered by a leash of braided leather, trotted Pip. The presence of a dog in a formal salon was unheard of, a breach of etiquette that had the doorman stammering. But Phineas had silenced them with a single, icy glare and a reminder of the charter. Wherever the guardian went, the Ashton heir went. To Eulalie's astonishment, the scruffy terrier was not the pariah she expected. As the initial shock wore off, the ladies of the court, bored with the usual gossip, found themselves enchanted. Pip, oblivious of social hierarchy, offered a polite, joyful bark to a dowager countess, and promptly sat on her velvet slipper. "Oh, look at his ears!" a debutante cooed, leaning down. Pip basked in the attention, his tail wagging a steady rhythm that seemed to hypnotize the circle forming around them. For a brief, shining moment, Eulalie felt the tension in her chest loosen. She smiled as Pip rolled onto his back, soliciting belly rubs from a formidable-looking general. Phineas watched the scene, his rugged features softening, his guard lowering just enough for Eulalie to see the man beneath the title. Then the air in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as the crowd near the entrance parted like the Red Sea. Baroness Clotilde swept into the room, a vision of malice in crimson silk. She did not look like a widow. She looked like an executioner. Her eyes locked onto Eulalie across the room, and the smile that curved her lips was terrifyingly familiar. Clotilde did not wait for an introduction. She marched through the throng, her gaze raking over Eulalie's square neckline dress with performative pity before turning her attention to the Duke. "Your Grace," Clotilde said, her voice loud enough to carry to the gallery. "How quaint to see you parading my stepdaughter around town, and with the mongrel, no less." Phineas stepped forward, placing himself between Eulalie and the Baroness. "Baroness, I see mourning suits you as ill as silence does." Clotilde's eyes flashed. She raised a gloved hand, pointing an accusing finger straight at Eulalie's chest. The leather of the glove creaked in the sudden silence of the room. "Do not play the hero, Phineas," she spat, abandoning all pretense of civility. "We all know why she is really at Ashton Hall. Do you take society for fools? Charter? Please. She is a penniless girl with a talent for manipulation, and you are a man known for his eccentric appetites." She swept her hand around the room, addressing the onlookers. "She seduced her way into that carriage before my husband was cold in his grave. She is no ward. She is a usurper hiding behind a puppy." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Eulalie felt the blood drain from her face, the room spinning. The whispers began instantly, a rising tide of scandal that threatened to drown her. Phineas went rigid. His hand dropped to his side, clenching into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white. The scar on his chin throbbed, visible even in the candlelight. He took a step toward Clotilde, his height suddenly looming, his wind-blown hair in dark intensity, making him look dangerous, a wolf facing down a snake. "One more word," Phineas growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder that vibrated to the floorboards, "and I will forget that you are a woman of rank. I will remember only that you are a liar." But as he spoke, Eulalie saw the doubt flickering in the eyes of the crowd. The Baroness's poison had found its mark. Phineas could command armies and estates, but could he command the truth in a city that feasted on lies? Or would his rugged defense shatter under the weight of a scandal designed to destroy them both? The grand winter ball of the Duchess of York's estate was intended to be the crowning jewel of the season, a kaleidoscope of swirling velvet, candlelight, and hushed whispers. But for Eulalie, standing beneath the colossal crystal chandelier, the air felt thin and brittle, ready to shatter. She clutched her fan so tightly the ivory ribs threatened to snap. Beside her, Phineas stood like a breakwater against a tide of curious stares, his rugged presence a stark contrast to perfumed fops surrounding them. The orchestra had just struck the opening notes of a waltz when the heavy double doors were thrown open with a violence that silenced the violins. Baroness Clotilde stood on the threshold, flanked by two breathless footmen she had evidently shoved aside. She held a sheaf of papers in her hand, waving them like a weapon. "Stop the charade." Clotilde's voice screeched, cutting through the cavernous hall. She marched into the center of the dance floor, her eyes wild with malice. "You stand there, Duke, parading this girl like a prize, but you are nothing but a fraud. I have proof that the dog is a common stray, and your precious charter is a fabrication designed to steal my husband's estate." The room erupted into gasps. Eulalie shrank back, the blood draining from her face. This was it, the ruin she had feared. Clotilde had weaponized the very thing that had saved her. Phineas did not flinch. Instead, he released Eulalie's arm and stepped forward, placing himself directly in Clotilde's path. His hair, usually so wild, seemed to bristle with electricity, framing a face fierce with protectiveness. The scar on his chin stood out stark, white against his flushed skin. "You speak of fraud, Baroness?" Phineas's voice was not loud, but it carried a deadly weight that reached every corner of the room. "You, who evicted your own stepdaughter before her father's body was cold. The charter is ironclad. But since you seem confused about Miss Moss's standing, let me make it unequivocally clear." He turned back to Eulalie, ignoring the hundreds of watching eyes. He took her trembling hands in his thumbs grazing her knuckles. The rage in his eyes vanished, replaced by a desperate, burning intensity. "Eulalie," he said, his voice roughening, "I told you once that this was a transaction. I was a liar then. You have healed parts of me I thought dead and buried. I do not wish to be your guardian. I wish to be your husband." He dropped to one knee, the crowd holding its collective breath. "Marry me. Let me protect you, not because of a dog, but because I cannot breathe without you." Eulalie looked down at him, tears blurring her vision. This was no performance. The raw vulnerability in his eyes told her everything. "Yes," she whispered, choked with emotion. "Yes, Phineas." He rose and pulled her into a crushing embrace, kissing her amidst the thunderous applause that broke the tension. Over Eulalie's shoulder, Phineas cast a look of pure glacial fury at Clotilde. "Remove that woman," he commanded the footman. "She is no longer welcome in polite society." Sputtering and defeated, Clotilde was escorted out, her threats drowned out by the renewed music. Later, seeking reprieve from the well-wishers, Phineas led Eulalie to the terrace. The night air was cool, and for the first time, Eulalie felt truly safe. But as Phineas turned to pour them a glass of wine from a nearby table, a shadow detached itself from the pillars. "A touching performance, Your Grace," a smooth, dark voice crooned. Phineas froze, the glass in his hand trembling. He turned slowly to face the intruder, a tall, gaunt man with eyes like polished coal. "Lord Blackwood," Phineas breathed, his face draining of color. "I see you found a new dog to replace the one we killed," the man said, stepping into the light with a cruel smile. "Does she know, Phineas? Does she know it wasn't the storm that killed Dash?" Does she know who really threw the stick into the river? Eulalie felt Phineas's hand go cold in hers. The joy of the proposal evaporated, replaced by the suffocating weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The ghost had returned, and this time, love alone might not be enough to hold them back. The morning of the wedding, the mist that usually clung to the grounds of Ashton Hall lifted, revealing a sky of piercing, limitless blue. It was as if the estate itself, having slumbered in gray mourning for so long, had finally decided to wake up. Eulalie stood before the tall mirror in the bridal suite, her reflection unrecognizable from the trembling girl who had once clutched a puppy in a cold library. Her strawberry blonde hair was woven with small white blossoms, and her gown, a creation of ivory, silk, and lace, did not hide her faint freckles but seemed to celebrate them. She was no longer a shadow. She was the light at the center of the room. The ceremony in the private chapel was intimate. When the heavy oak doors opened, the air was filled not with judgment, but with the scent of lilies and beeswax. Phineas waited at the altar. The wind-blown wildness of his hair had been tamed, but the rugged intensity of his gaze remained. As Eulalie walked toward him, she saw the scar on his chin, not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to survival. The ghost of the past, stirred up by Lord Blackwood's cruel taunts, had not torn them apart. Instead, the truth had been a cauterizing fire. They had faced the darkness of Dash's death together. Phineas finally forgiving the 12-year-old boy he once was, allowing the wound to close at last. When he took her hand, his grip was warm and steady. "To my guardian," he whispered, a secret vow before the official ones, "who saved me from the storm." They were pronounced man and wife amidst a hush of genuine reverence. But as they turned to leave the chapel, the heavy thud of a cane against the stone floor shattered the peace. Baroness Clotilde stood in the archway of the chapel entrance. She looked diminished, her once voluminous hair appearing brittle, her fashionable morning dress now looking like a costume from a play that had closed. She had not been invited, yet she stood there, desperation etching deep lines around her mouth. "You think this changes anything?" Clotilde hissed, though her voice lacked its former venomous power. It was thin, reedy. "You are still a nobody, Eulalie, a pauper dressed in stolen silk. You will destroy him just as you destroyed your father's legacy." Phineas stepped forward, his eyes darkening, ready to defend his bride. But Eulalie placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. She did not need him to fight this battle. She stepped forward, the silk of her gown rustling softly, until she stood toe-to-toe with the woman who had tormented her for years. Eulalie did not tremble. She did not look down. She looked Clotilde in the eye, her gaze steady and clear. "You are mistaken, Clotilde," Eulalie said, her voice calm, echoing clearly in the silent chapel. "I did not destroy my father's legacy. I saved it, and as for my worth, it is not determined by your opinion, nor by the estate I did not inherit. It is determined by the love I hold in the family I have built." She gestured to the footmen waiting by the carriage. "You are trespassing on the Duchess of Ashton's property. Please remove yourself, or I shall have the groundskeeper escort you out. He has little patience for strays." Clotilde gasped, the color draining from her face as her own cruel insult from the library was turned against her. She looked around, seeking allies, but found only the stony faces of the Ashton staff and the pitying glances of the guests. Defeated, she turned and fled, her heels clacking unevenly on the cobblestones, fading into irrelevance. Eulalie turned back to Phineas, who was watching her with a look of awe. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the ring that now bound them. "My Duchess," he murmured. Suddenly, a joyous bark erupted from the front pew. Pip, wearing a silk bow tie that was already askew, wriggled free from the butler's grasp and barreled down the aisle. He leaped, and Phineas caught him mid-air, laughing, a true, deep sound that banished the last of the shadows from Ashton Hall. As they walked out into the sunlight, Phineas with his arm around Eulalie and the little gray terrier, squirming happily between them. The world felt new. They had found healing in the unlikeliest of places, proving that even the deepest scars can fade when touched by love. If the terror of never hearing how hearts mend in tales like this haunts you, subscribe instantly. Don't risk the regret. And if you still hesitate, confess in the comments why you deny yourself these redemptive endings.